My name is Jessica Crouch, and I am the Community Engagement Coordinator for ArchivesSpace. One of the key aspects of my role is to support the ArchivesSpace community through trainings, webinars, and events like this forum, and to communicate with archivists about ArchivesSpace and how they can best implement ArchivesSpace at their institution. So I'm very happy to be offering this overview of ArchivesSpace today. I'm going to briefly highlight the ArchivesSpace application, including the staff user interface, the public user interface, and some of the record types you can create in the application. While I will be focusing on how you create those record types, please know you can edit, delete, transfer, merge, export, and run a variety of reports from these records. It just isn't something I'm going to have time to explore in this overview. If you would like to see more after this overview, I recommend viewing the ArchivesSpace Basics online workshop available on our YouTube channel in our workshops playlist. Or if you're from an ArchivesSpace member institution, there is an expansive series of tutorial videos available in the Help Center along with our user manual. So ArchivesSpace can be accessed from any web browser. This is the simple welcome screen you encounter after you log into ArchivesSpace. The staff interface is where archivists can organize and describe material, enabling access and discovery. I'm going to highlight the primary command zones in the staff user interface that an archivist would use to create and manage records and set repository and global preferences. So the initial staff user interface is divided up into 4 command zones. On the upper right, you have a section related to repository management. Here you can select what repository you'd like to be working in. You may only have one repository in your ArchivesSpace instance, or you may have several, one for each department or archive at your institution. When you log into ArchivesSpace, you will be logged into the repository you were assigned by an administrator in ArchivesSpace. Access to different repositories within your instance of ArchivesSpace will depend on your user permission level. Administrators will have access to all repositories, while most users will probably only have access to the repository that correlates to the department or archive in which they work. Any records you create will be saved within the repository selected here. And if you're attempting to locate a specific record, you need to make sure you're in the repository where that record is saved to locate it. To the right of the repository selection, you have the system zone. Here you can manage users, manage repositories, configure control value lists, and view system information such as log files without having to leave the application. Because these preferences impact ArchivesSpace at the application and at the repository level, these options are only available if you have administrator privileges in ArchivesSpace or if you have been granted access through user permissions. If you don't, the only thing you will be able to see is the option to visit the Help Center here at the bottom. Also on the upper right-hand corner, you have an area related to user permissions, preference management, imports, and plugins. You can also manage groups and users associated with the repository, transfer the contents of one repository to another, run background jobs and reports, and invoke any plugin functions. On the left hand of the interface, you have options related to creating, editing, and deleting records. Accession, resource, and digital object records are known collectively as material description records in ArchivesSpace. These are the 3 record types you see listed above that little line in the dropdown. Resource and digital object records both allow for multi-level description or the presence of component records. I'll get into that a little bit more later. The other records, subject, agent, location, etc., are for amplifying the description record, indicating the whereabouts of the material, recording actions done to the material. So I'll discuss a little some of these record types later. All of the record types for the create option can be created independently of any other record and then later linked to other records. For example, you could create a single location record every time you finish processing or cataloging a box and put it on a shelf, and then you link it to that single location record. Or you could create a batch of location records in advance and have them available in the application whenever you're ready to use them. The same is true for something like subjects or agents. The background jobs link that is at the bottom of the create dropdown allows staff to go to the background job page where you can create jobs to batch, find, and replace data, import data, or print to PDF. You can also browse all of these record types using the browse option beside the create button. The final major section of the staff user interface is the ability to perform a keyword search labeled Search All Records. with an advanced search dropdown. Both options permit searching every type of record in the ArchivesSpace application in the repository that you have selected. In the advanced search, you can search by keyword, creator, note, subject, title, etc. When an action is taken on a record, so meaning when it was created or updated, and whether or not a record is published or suppressed. These search fields can be used in any combination together, but the search must be connected with Boolean operators, and or and not are available, and is the default option for linking the search fields together. By default, ArchivesSpace searches and retrieves records for the active repository only in a search. You can perform searches to find accession, resource, archival object, and digital object records that contain matching text. All data fields in these records can be searched, as well as linked data and accession and resource records. So I'm going to go ahead and start discussing what these records are, beginning with accession records. So this is what a completed accession record looks like in the staff user interface of ArchivesSpace. Accession records store information about the receipt of materials, which are typically unprocessed or uncatalogued. An accession record may be for a single item or an aggregation of materials. It may represent the acquisition of a new collection or the accrual to an existing resource. Accession records may also be linked to other types of ArchivesSpace records, such as existing resource, digital object, subject, or agent records. To navigate to the elements within records in ArchivesSpace, you can do so either by scrolling or by using the navigation on the left. I'm going to highlight both options in this overview. So to create an accession record, on the main toolbar, you would click Create and select Accession. For an accession record, ArchivesSpace only requires one element for an ArchivesSpace valid accession record, and that's an identifier. This record would serve only to document that there was an accession event. Of course, you'd want to enter more elements as desired. In ArchivesSpace, if you have questions about fields, there are hover over tooltips available. These tooltips are customizable, so you can adjust them to suit your use of a specific content standard or your own internal practice. Also, if you are from an ArchivesSpace member institution, you can click on the little question marks that you see throughout the application and be taken to the pages of our user manual that relate to that specific topic. So let's return to that completed accession record and explore a couple other fields you may want to use. The title of the accession is probably something you do want to include, and it will typically, but not always, match the title of the resource to which the accession belongs. So when you are spawning a resource, this field maps to the resource title. It is particularly useful to include as much information as you can if you intend to spawn a resource record from an accession record. This means creating a template for your resource record with data populated from an accession record. A sparse accession record would mean a sparse resource record to start with. So I'll talk about spawning a little more in a minute. When you're ready to save a record in ArchivesSpace, you would select Save Accession here because we're talking about accession records. And if there were any required elements missing, you would be prompted to add that information before you could save the record. You could link this accession record to other records, including other accessions or resource records, and you can link as many resource records to an accession as necessary. To link a related resource to an accession record, you would click Related Resources on the left navigation or scroll down, and then click Add Related Resource here on the right side of the screen and browse for a previously created resource record. You can link related accessions in a similar fashion. And as I mentioned, another nice feature is the ability to spawn a resource record from a saved accession record. That means that data in the accession record will be transferred into a new resource record by spawning it. Edits to the spawned resource record do not change the accession record it came from. You cannot transfer data from an accession record to an existing resource record via spawning. This would only work for a new record. It would create a new resource record that would look like this. You notice that there are some required elements missing that are required of a resource record. You would be required to fill those out before you could save this record. So with that, we'll move on to another major record type in ArchivesSpace, and that is the resource record. Spawning a resource record from an accession record isn't the only way to create a resource record in ArchivesSpace. You don't need an accession record in ArchivesSpace to create a resource record. You can create a new resource record independently of another record. You can create a resource record through the drop-down menu on the upper left that I showed before for the accession record and select Create Resource Record. This will open a blank resource record, which looks like this. So I'm going to go ahead and show you a completed resource record. Within the context of ArchivesSpace, resources can be defined as materials that are in the custody of an archival repository and are being controlled according to archival principles. So basically, anything you want to describe archivally. Each resource has a singular identity, like a resource identifier or a title, and an archival resource may be comprised of one single item, or more typically, it's going to be an aggregation of items that can be of any extent or complexity, a collection. Resource records are where you place the bulk of information about the intellectual and physical characteristics of archival material. Within a given resource record, you can add a range of descriptive elements, as well as notes, right statements, and linked repository records. The description of the archival resource can be supplemented with certain context and content descriptors. So I'm going to spend some time exploring some of those available notes and fields for resource records now, since most of the record types can be applied and appear for accession and digital object records as well. So within ArchivesSpace, the required elements for a resource record include basic information like the title, identifier, and level of description, as well as language, date, and extent notes. The title is an open text field that you would assign. The identifier is also an open text field that you would assign. The level of description you would choose from a drop-down list, and that just indicates the hierarchical level of the materials being described. So this is a collection being described at the collection level. The languages subrecord is also required for resource records. It is optional for all other record types. Users must enter at least one language. Language and scripts of material must be selected via the controlled value drop-down lists. And you can add as many language instances as needed. Users are not required to enter a language of materials note, but you may want to use that note in a few different cases. For example, if a language is not available, you could select the value undetermined for the language instance, and then utilize the language of material note to enter the language that's not available in the dropdown. Or if there's a variant spelling of the language, you could select the ISO value in the dropdown and then use the language of material note to enter the language with the alternative spelling. The dates field is also required. This identifies the dates that pertain to the creation, accumulation, or maintenance of the material being described. The required fields are label and type of date, and then you must include either a date expression or normalized begin and end dates. The extent field is also required. This subrecord is used for recording the items, the volumes, or containers of the described materials. The required fields are portion, number, and type. You can add as many extent records as you need. Depending on your repository practice, an example of data entry might be to enter one extent record for the whole collection, the whole portion, so 100 boxes for that whole collection. And then you might enter a second or third record recording the extent to measure parts of the collection. For example, an extent part for a count of photographs, floppy disks, or artifacts. Consistency in how you use the whole and part extents will greatly aid in your ability to report out consistent statistics. Two fields that are not required for resource record creation, but I'm going to go ahead and highlight, are the right statements and instances. So the right statement subrecord is for recording information about the right status of the material being described. It can be used for aggregates of material or for just a single item in the collection. Right statements can only be created within the context of an accession or resource or a digital object. And it cannot be viewed or edited independently of its context. So to view the rights associated with an accession or a collection, you have to navigate to that object and view the rights statement within it. Like a few other record types in ArchivesSpace, the rights statement subrecord also allows the option of linking to one or more external documents. So if you have a deed of gift or some sort of institutional policy, you can attach it there. The rights subrecord really has very few required fields. Each repository should develop its own policies and procedures for determining when and how to use the fields and to add as many as necessary. The second, not required, but I'm highlighting it here, note type is instance. Instances in ArchivesSpace refer to the embodiments of the same content in different versions or different media types. So for example, an archival object may be a letter, but that letter may exist in multiple formats. You may have that original piece of paper with ink on it, that letter, and then at some point the letter was microfilmed, and then recently you digitized the letter and now you have a PDF. So the content of the letter is embodied in 3 distinct formats. ArchivesSpace is designed to allow you to use the same content description in ArchivesSpace for those multiple instances of the item, rather than having to repeat it over and over for new instances. Equally important, listing instances in the one archival item in ArchivesSpace allows you to list physical items and digital content together. If you look at the example on the screen, there's an instance here for material that is in a box, as well as an instance for a digital object. So they're linked together in the same record. It also allows you to describe the containers that house the material, like boxes and folders, and link that information to a location record to where that container is stored in your repository. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. For digital objects, the instance record allows you to record information about the files, as well as indicating its location on the web or within your file management system. So once you've completed your top level collection resource record, which is what we just looked at, you're ready to add component records. ArchivesSpace supports the creation of resource records comprising multi-level descriptions. So you can see here a number of component records up at the top for this resource represented in the hierarchy. So let's explore one of those. Let's select correspondence. Component records require the following elements: a level, which you would choose from a drop-down containing the values class, file, item, series, subseries, subbond, subgroup, or other level, and then either a title or a date. Like the resource record, the resource component record accommodates extensive description of the component, including the same support for note subrecords I demonstrated before. But you should use your own specific guidelines and standards to help you determine which of the available fields you should use. So to create a component record, you would select a context record you want to add a component record to. So here we've selected correspondence, and you see where correspondence exists in the hierarchy of this collection. And if you would like to create a component record that relates to correspondence, you would add either a child, which these are the children of correspondence, or a sibling. Photographs is the sibling of correspondence. If you're at that collection level, adding a child component record will be your only option. You won't be able to add a sibling. Once you make that selection, you will receive a blank component record template. Another way to create component records is through the rapid data entry function, which is this. You'd select rapid data entry here, and it looks like this. The RDE tool supports repeated entry of resource component records at the same level, so it requires fewer mouse clicks and it saves time. You can also create preset templates in the rapid data entry tool, so it's more efficient when you're entering like a list of information where it's the same basic content being entered over and over. And all of the same notes and subrecords for component record template are available in the RDE tool, and you can just select which ones you want available. Yet another way to add values is to load them via spreadsheet. There's a preset template for this, which you would use, and then you would upload the completed spreadsheet. This is the fastest way to get information into ArchivesSpace in my experience. Another record type managed in ArchivesSpace are digital objects. You can create a digital object record within the context of an associated accession or resource record via that instance section I showed earlier by adding a digital object. Or you can create a digital object independently through the create dropdown. This is a digital object record in ArchivesSpace. By using ArchivesSpace to manage digital object metadata, you can conveniently manage descriptions of your archival holdings within a single system. Additionally, you can link these digital objects to accession and resource records within ArchivesSpace, and then publish the accession or resource record through the ArchivesSpace public interface. You can also export the resource record as an EAD finding aid. The resulting accession or resource records would have links to their associated digital object records, providing users with more comprehensive access to your holdings. It's important to note that ArchivesSpace is optimized for managing metadata records. ArchivesSpace does not support the direct management of content files and is not a digital asset management system. So this is a digital object record for a single item. It's a watercolor of a fly fishing lure. And you notice down here, it's the file version. You see the file URI there. This is what that whole section looks like. So when I click on this link, which tells you where that image is stored, if I'm in the public user interface, that's what this looks like. When I click on that link, I'm taken to the file server and I can see an image of that lure. Functionally, ArchivesSpace supports the management of digital object metadata that can be exported as METs, the Metadata and Encoding Transmission Standard format. The METs files contain a complete representation of the digital object and can be transmitted to a preservation service for long-term storage and or to your publication service for dissemination to end users. In ArchivesSpace, a digital object may be recorded either as a simple object or a complex object. This is an example of a simple digital object. A simple object is one in which the intellectual content of the object is contained in one digital content file. This digital file could be a single photograph or a single watercolor image like we just saw, or it could be a PDF document comprising an entire multi-page work. A whole book could be represented. It's just one single file. Simple objects are single level in structure, and they comprise a metadata record that's represented for the entire item in one record. A complex digital object is one in which the intellectual content is distributed over 2 or more digital content files. So you notice here, each item in the hierarchy at the top has a digital content file associated with it. A digitized version of the same multi-page work, the same book that I referenced before, would be a complex digital object if each page was represented by an individual digital file. Complex digital files require structural metadata, so the parts of the whole will be represented in the right sequence. So they comprise that same parent level metadata record representing a description of the entire item, and then they have 1 or more child level component records, and each component has its own content file. So if you're familiar with creating and managing resource records in ArchivesSpace, this hierarchical structure is familiar. When building digital object records in ArchivesSpace, you have the flexibility to model them as either simple or complex. Neither is wrong as long as you are consistent. So those are the material description records you can create in ArchivesSpace, accession, resource, and digital object records. I'm now going to highlight some of the other record types you can create in ArchivesSpace. These records can be used to add additional description and information to archival objects. Other records you can create include subject and agent records, classifications, event records, assessment records, location management, and container management records. So the first thing I want to discuss is container management in ArchivesSpace. So let's return to an archival descriptive record at the instance level. This is where you can link your archival object to a container instance. When adding a container instance, the required fields are type and top container. A top container is the highest level container in which an archival object is held. Sometimes it might be the only container, so all of your items reside in a box. Other times it may be the external container, which holds additional containers like folders. So ArchivesSpace can track these items at the folder level, but the box is the top container for all of those items. A top container record provides a way for linking many archival objects to the same container. For example, if you move box 1 in your collection to a new location and box 1 contains 50 archival objects in their own folders, updating the location of that box 1 top container will update the location across all 50 records. Top containers are usually created in the context of a material description record, so an accession, resource, or resource component, but they can also be created separately. This may be helpful for managing containers that are shared, like if you have an oversized box that holds oversized items for many resources. To add a container instance to an archival object, you would select Add Container Instance and select either Create or Browse. You could browse or search if you knew that your top container already existed. So to create a top container, the indicator is the required field. It's an alphanumeric indicator. So if this is box 1, you'd put 1 as the indicator. Other fields include container type, which is a drop-down list where you could select box, folder, etc. And then also one of the other options is container profile. I'm going to talk about that for just a second. A container profile enables you to specify certain characteristics for a type of top container, like its dimensions. The container profile is optional, but the dimensions can be used to calculate extent and automatically create extent subrecords. And if you would like to make use of the space calculator, which can determine where you have space in your holdings for new material, you need to use container profiles. Container profiles can be linked to instances in Accession or resource records. Once you've completed all your information, you would just select Create and Link to Top Containers. There are several bulk operations you can perform on top containers. You would do this via Manage Top Containers from this dropdown in the staff user interface. Via this interface, you can search for top containers by barcode, resource, etc. So here I performed a search. And then you would make the selections on the boxes that return in the search and perform the bulk actions on the selected boxes. You could update your ILS holding IDs. So if you link your containers to your holding records in your catalog, you could update those container profiles. If you want to change the container profile associated with the containers, you could update either single or multiple locations. You could enter barcodes, or you could delete top containers. Just be aware that if you do delete top containers and they are associated with archival objects via instances, you will also be deleting those associated instances. All right, another record type I want to talk about very briefly are location records. Location records describe any shelving location, so your shelves, drawers, files, cases, where archival materials are stored. Location records are designed to track the permanent location of materials, but you could also designate temporary locations as well. Location records are intended for physical shelving space, not for web accessible locations. So locations for materials on the web are managed via those URIs recorded as part of digital object records. Location records use a coordinate system to represent a repository storage space. For example, a coordinate may be a range, a shelf, a flat file, that sort of thing. Location records can be entered and edited at any time, but it may be most effective to create them all at once for an entire repository and then just link them as needed. To create a single location record, you would just select either from the pull-down menu, create location, single location, or you could also, from the location browse menu, you could select create location. And ArchivesSpace only requires one element in a location record, and that required element is the building. It conditionally requires either a barcode, a classification, or coordinate label 1 and coordinate indicator 1. You can also create locations in batch. Same thing, you would just select create batch locations from the dropdown. To create a batch location, in the base location section here, you would at least need to record a building value. That's the required field. And then in the coordinate ranges section at the bottom, you would need to enter values for at least coordinate range 1, and where the range starts and where it ends. You can preview your location records to make sure they're correctly formed by clicking on the free preview locations button, and it will show you all of the locations you're about to create. It's definitely worth the time to preview your locations because there's nothing like creating 1,000 locations and then realizing you've made a typo. If you're happy with your locations, you would select create locations and all of those records would be created in ArchivesSpace. One final record type I want to briefly go over in ArchivesSpace are assessments. Assessment records are a useful record type to use in conjunction with your material description records because they contain information about the quantitative and qualitative condition of surveyed material. So its readiness for reformatting, housing, physical arrangement, intellectual access, and research value. Assessment can occur at various points in the life cycle of an archival collection and for many reasons, so you can have as many assessments linked to one archival object as you need. Assessment records can be linked to Accession, resource, and digital object records. Assessment records can be linked to and can apply to a single record or to multiple records. Exactly how you use this module will depend on your own internal workflow and processes. You can create an assessment either via the drop-down, create assessment, or on the upper right hand of the page when browsing assessments. ArchivesSpace requires 3 elements for a valid assessment record: a link to the resource that was assessed, a link to the agent who did the surveying, and the date that the survey began. This documents only that an assessment occurred, so you would likely wish to enter other elements. You can include information about the assessment that ranks the condition of the materials on a scale of 1 to 5, list the types of materials present, and make notes about value and make determinations about conservation. You can edit or add new assessments to resources as appropriate, and you can link multiple assessments to one record. And so you can also indicate which assessment is the active or more relevant assessment for making determinations about the material. Finally, I'd like to very quickly highlight the public user interface of ArchivesSpace. The ArchivesSpace public user interface provides a platform dedicated to searching, browsing, and discovering archival collection materials, and provides an intuitive way to give your users access to information while maintaining a single system for data entry. Use of the public interface is optional. Instead of using the public interface, some repositories will choose to export metadata outputs like EAD, MarkXML, or EAC CPF files into other systems. Under its default configurations, the public interface will be available at port 8081 of the same server where your staff interface is found, but that port location can be customized and it can be mapped to a more user-friendly URL. Your system administrator can also customize the public interface to display your logo or change the color scheme and text, but this is what the public user interface looks like out of the box. In the public interface, users can browse by repository, resource or collections, digital materials, your accessions, which are called unprocessed materials in the public user interface, subjects, agents, or names in the public user interface, and classifications called record groups in the public user interface. The title of any of these headers can be changed, or they can be hidden from public view altogether if, for example, your accessions maybe are not the type of record that you normally let users access. Whether a user is searching or browsing, they will be accessing all records across an ArchivesSpace installation that you have elected to publish. The PUI has a basic Google-style keyword search as well as an advanced search option. This is the basic search screen that you encounter when you visit ArchivesSpace. Records in your search result can be filtered and sorted, and you can do that browsing as well. Additionally, you can narrow your search results by record type, search term type, and a limited date range. You can also use the plus symbol to add additional rows to the search tool and construct more complicated and precise queries using Boolean operators, again, and, or, and not. If you would like a record to be included in the public user interface, you need to elect to publish it via the radio button on the staff side to indicate this. So we're back on the staff side. You can elect to publish an entire record or just individual elements of the record. So you'll see options throughout a record with, to publish. If you just click these little boxes, you'll only be publishing the section of the record that you've elected to publish. However, if you'd like to publish an entire record, the fastest thing to do is to select Publish All. Once published, the record will become discoverable on the public user interface. So if you're working in ArchivesSpace and you're curious what your record will look like in the public user interface, you can use the View Published option, and it will open up a new tab in your browser window to display the public interface for the record that you have created in ArchivesSpace. So this is what it would look like in the public user interface. So that concludes my very quick overview of some of the core ArchivesSpace functions. On this slide, I have listed some useful resources for learning more about ArchivesSpace or getting started with ArchivesSpace. The link at the bottom includes links to that getting started, that basics workshop I talked about, as well as demos and webinars and other resources that you may find useful. But with that, I'll go ahead and open the floor to any questions.
Jessica, are there any areas of the application that you find people ask you questions a lot about that maybe take a little bit longer to adjust to?
I just think some of the things like the notion of top containers, some of that terminology takes a little bit of getting used to, but the thing to keep in mind is that most of what you will be doing in ArchivesSpace, or what a user is doing in ArchivesSpace, is not necessarily new. As archivists, we've been doing it for a long time. ArchivesSpace is just a new tool. So sort of learning how to work ArchivesSpace into your workflow is a lot of the discussions that I have. Another thing that I will point out, and I only talked about it very briefly, is the ability to load in information via spreadsheet, which is right now that's a plugin that has to be invoked, but with the next release, that's going to become part of core code. Being able to clean up your data or create your record as a spreadsheet and then upload it is something that is very useful, because it's a format that we're all familiar with, and it's also a great way to maybe get student workers or paraprofessionals involved in creating records in ArchivesSpace without having them do too much actual work in ArchivesSpace.
Jessica, hi. This is Venkat here. So it's regarding the spreadsheet that you just pointed out to, would you have a few minutes just to maybe just walk through what the fields of the spreadsheet are going to be like and such? I remember it used to have very specific sort of requirements, but that was a long time ago, and we haven't started using that yet at our end.
I don't actually have the template available on my computer to show, but it is pretty expansive. It has all of the fields included. I will drop into the chat a link to that GitHub if anyone would like to review the template that's available. There are a few other resources or a few other workflows that you can use to ingest information via spreadsheet without having to use that template. I can drop those into the chat as well. I'll also mention Venkat, if you are an ArchivesSpace member institution in the Help Center, we have a tutorial video on implementing that plugin and then using the spreadsheet, which is very extensive. Christine Kim, who recorded that video, walks through how to fill out the fields in the spreadsheet.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thanks.
I'm curious of this is Christine DeBell. I'm the program manager for ArchivesSpace. Since we're a small group here, I wonder if people would be willing to put in the chat if they don't want to unmute themselves, whether you're already using ArchivesSpace and how long you've been using it if you have. So it looks like we're kind of running the gamut here. Great. So I'm just going to read things out here. Jessica, unless you want to read them out, you might be a little tired from talking. So I'm happy to read these out. And I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name, but Arancha, you say that you're in the process of implementation. I'm curious what institution you're from. And Nick, he's from the Industrial Archives and Library, one of our very active ArchivesSpace members, adopted in 2017. Tanya Ryan from Brisbane in Australia, your new user for Queensland State Archives. That's great. Lynn Drennan, 2 years you've been using it. And also, if you wouldn't mind saying what institution you're from, I'd be very interested. Hillary, you're from the Peabody Essex Museum in Massachusetts, where I am as well, and you're up late as I am as well, using it for about a year. And Saskia Van Bergen, and apologies again if I'm mispronouncing, you're planning to get ArchivesSpace. So you're sort of starting right out on this. So you say that it's helpful for you to see this. That's excellent. And Venkat at the National Center for Biological Sciences in India. So you're still getting kind of ramped up, but you've been very actively involved. We're so pleased with that. Using for about 1.5 years, but still minimal use and haven't updated in a year now. So kind of coming back to it, Philip, you're currently running test and development instances with plans to go live late this year. Oh, exciting. And Philip, what institution are you from? Jessica's dropped those links in there to get to the Harvard plugin tool. Certainly the most popular plugin that there is out there for ArchivesSpace. Jayashree, and I don't know what that acronym is, QAMRA. You're setting up a queer archive, thinking of using ArchivesSpace. Oh, that sounds very interesting. So Hillary asks Jessica if you just demoed the latest version, if you want to answer that.
I did. So that was ArchivesSpace version 2.7.1, which is the newest release of ArchivesSpace, or the most recent release of ArchivesSpace. However, we will be having version 2.8 coming out in the next few weeks, right, Christy?
Should be. Should be.
Which will include a lot of really great stuff, including the inclusion of that load via spreadsheet plugin, the Harvard import tool, as core code. So that is something that will be coming out as core code soon.
So we've got 2 people from University of Sheffield here. That's excellent. Jessica dropped some more links in there for awesome ArchivesSpace, which is a really great resource, as she says. California State, Sacramento, Leiden University Libraries, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. So National Library of Scotland is also here using ArchivesSpace on an older version. And says, you've been using it for a couple of years on that version, so this was a helpful overview of the newer version. Excellent. And Jayashree, you're from Queer Archive for Memory, Reflection, and Activism, based in Bangalore, India. Oh, excellent. Okay. So we have quite a few different countries and types of archives represented here tonight. We're really glad to have that. Does anyone have any questions for Jessica? Is there anything that you want to stump her about, functionality-wise?
It's almost 2 a.m. It wouldn't be hard.
This is the perfect time. This is the perfect time. If anyone has something they've been dying to know about how it works in ArchivesSpace, it's the perfect time to ask. But also, just kidding aside, does anyone have any other questions for Jessica about functionality in ArchivesSpace and sort of those major areas that she was showing?
And it doesn't have to be just those. Any questions you have about using ArchivesSpace or maybe your implementation, I'd be happy to answer. Cat is trying to stump me. Here's a 2 a.m. question for Jessica. Would there be any plans to export any of the material out to a spreadsheet? So there are some record types that you can export to CSV, Cat. It would depend on what you're trying to do.
Do you have a particular thing in mind, Venkat? And what sometimes the purpose that you would be using it for is really helpful to sort of determine what might be the best way to get it out.
Yeah, sorry, Jessica, I was just teasing you. It's so nice that you guys are up so late. No, I think I was just thinking, at our end, we sort of made a decision to go into it, but I'm thinking, say, 5, 6, 7 years down the line when I'm no longer out, at the institute, and someone else has to figure out a way to migrate from an ArchivesSpace instance into whatever else might be at that point. I'm just wondering I mean, all said and done, a spreadsheet ends up being the thing that a lot of people end up defaulting to. So that was just my thought process, that, you know, what happens a decade down the line sort of thing. But yeah, I don't have any specific resources that I was thinking of exporting.
There also is a MySQL database behind all of this, where your information is stored. So sometimes, depending on like where you need to take it next, going directly from the database might be the most helpful way. But certainly, like, there's some record types in ArchivesSpace, any of the flatter ones, that probably would lend themselves to getting out in a spreadsheet. So if you needed to sort of get everything out at once, depending on what it is, that might be a good choice, or there might be some other things that might be a good choice for that.
Got it. Thank you. Thanks so much.